Hello, my name is Nick Kastner, host and co-creator of The Commonwealth, which is a podcast that features entrepreneurs, artists, and athletes that are leading disruptive change. Our interview for this next Monday's episode is with Ali Schwanke, the founder and CEO of Strat and the co-founder of Brand Plan. Before I sit down and chat with Ali, we have Senator Anna Wishart here to host a 20-minute-long question and answer session. Senator Wishart represents Lincoln in Nebraska's unicameral. Her district encompasses some of the poorest and richest communities in the state of Nebraska. She has sponsored legislation to make medical marijuana legal here in the state, and wrote a bill that makes Nebraska a leader in self-driving car technology. So before I hand the stage over to Senator Wishart, we're capturing all the audio and video of tonight. So if you ask a question, your voice will be on that, and we may need some teamwork to pass the microphone around. So thanks in advance for the help. So, ladies and gentlemen, Senator Anna Wishart.
Well, I'm going to sit everybody, and let's see if this microphone is on. Are we good? We're good. Well, hi, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. When Nick and I actually met, like right there, here in the Foundry, and it was after one meeting when you asked me, hey, will you be on the inaugural episode of my podcast, and I said, well, I'll think about it, and he followed up, and I love how hardworking you are on this, and I'm really excited, and it's a little bit of pressure to be on the first, but I'm excited to be here. So as Nick said, I represent District 27. I was elected 3 years to the legislature, and when I was thinking about how would I introduce myself, I think what I'll talk about is what I've learned, kind of the number one thing I've learned, having worked 3 years in politics as someone who before I got involved in politics was not a very political person. And I think what I've learned, and this is coming from serving in a legislature with 48 other individuals, where there's probably no way I would have ever been sitting around a table with them in all of their different walks of life in any other job. And so I feel very grateful for that. But it's also coming from the perspective of serving in a local level, in a local capacity, when all of the sort of national struggles are going on. And how I see all of this kind of affecting what happens on a local level as well on the national level. And I think the thing I've learned, and that I'll take away and hopefully keep with me for the rest of my life, is I've learned to be curious. And I think that word has become lost in recent time. I think a lot of times, and maybe it's with social media, exacerbates this. When you're confronted with someone who thinks different, we've gotten into this tendency to immediately kind of put a wall and say you're wrong or try to change their mind in one moment, instead of really asking, well, what is it in your life that has led you to think that way? And instead of being curious about why somebody would think that way, and maybe in finding that out about someone, you can make a connection with someone who thinks different than you. And I've had to do that because I work with people across the state who have had very different life paths to get to the legislature, who think very different than I do, fundamentally different than I do on a lot of issues. And we're kind of forced to have to work together, and so it forces us to be curious with each other. And it is a life skill that I will use for the rest of my life. So that's the takeaway I have from the 3 years I've been in the legislature.
So, do we have any questions for Senator Wishart?
Don't be shy.
Oh, perfect. Thank you, Alec. I don't know if I necessarily need the mic, but you're talking about curious. How do you think that's a learned activity, or how can we teach, especially at the younger level? And if you look at, elementary school, grade school, middle school, and then high school, how do we teach an individual to be curious?
I mean, that's such a great question. I would say kids are naturally curious. I would say that actually our social systems teach them not to be what comes very natural to young kids. And so I would say, actually, we should look at how we can really continue to champion what comes natural to kids in terms of not being afraid to ask tough questions, not being afraid to say things that they don't know, and also not being afraid to be around people that are different than them.
What's the most difficult vote that you've had to make in the Nebraska legislature?
Oh. I've had to make two. I've had to make two really tough votes. I would say the one that was the most painful, and it took me a while to kind of feel a sense of peace about it, was involving the budget. I sit on the Appropriations Committee, and so the way that we craft the budget is during committee, we negotiate what goes into that. We vote the budget out, and then it goes to the full legislature for the legislature to debate and then eventually pass. And in Nebraska, we've been always very dutiful about passing a budget. And several years ago, there was an item involved in our budget that would have cut funding to women's reproductive health care, which is an issue as a young woman and just as a human I feel very strongly about. I think it's very important that women have access to health care, and I believe in reproductive freedom. And, we fought in committee for it to stay out, this part of the budget that would have slashed some funding to Planned Parenthood. And unfortunately, I lost that fight in committee, and the budget came out. And as an Appropriations Committee member, I felt a sense of duty that we had to pass a budget. There was $50 million for child welfare. There was funding for women's health clinics. And so I voted to pass that budget and got a lot of criticism from women in my district and men in my district who cared about this issue. I feel very strongly that it needed to happen, but it was definitely the toughest issue I've ever worked on.
Back here, Senator Wishart.
So you had mentioned not being interested in politics. What got you interested? And then once you were, how did you get involved?
Yeah, so I never thought about running for office, and I wasn't involved in sort of party side of things when I was young. I was involved in constitutional debate as a high school student, but as a young woman, I just never imagined myself in that position because there aren't a lot of young women who serve. And I remember the moment I thought about running for the legislature. I was home, and I was at a luncheon with my mom celebrating Helen Busalis, who was Lincoln's first woman mayor. And Senator Amanda McGill was speaking at the time, and she was just this incredible young, vibrant woman who was elected when she was 26 to serve a sort of northeast district in Lincoln. And she spoke directly to the young women in the audience and said, "Don't wait. Think about running now." And I turned to it just clicked. It's one of those things, and it's why it's so important to expose kids at a young age to a variety of things that they can do, because sometimes you don't even know that that's what you wanted to do your whole life. And I went into it because I really like connecting with people, and I love problem solving. It's one of my favorite things to do is just sit around a table and figure out creatively how you can solve something. And it's turned out to be exactly that. It is, for anybody who's thinking about running, especially the state legislature, it is a really incredible job. If you like brainstorming and trying to figure out a solution to tough problems, you spend all day doing that.
Over here, Senator.
Hi, Senator. I'm a big fan of yours. Thank you for your public service. Two-part question. You've been a champion for the hemp industry, industrial, medical, and I'm curious where your philosophical basis comes from, where how you came to the conclusion that we should move more aggressively towards legalized marijuana. Second part of the question is, back to your curiosity with youth. These first-time users, they're going to go through some stuff, Could be time warp, could be, paranoia. How do you reconcile all that?
Well, so for the first part of the question, I tend to fall a little more on the libertarian side of things. If there is something in this world that statistics show is not a public health concern, which I think if you look at the facts around marijuana, you will find that in the grand scheme of things, it's far more benign than a lot of the things that are legal. Then I tend to feel that we should not be controlling what somebody does with their life, especially when it impacts their health care. So it was a very quick and very easy realization for me, so much so it took like 5 people at the doors to tell me this is an issue that they cared about, and to tell me what family member was struggling with it. And after that, I was like, oh yeah, absolutely. I'll introduce the bill as a freshman senator. I have no qualms about that. And luckily, it's one of those issues, the more and more I do research on it, the stronger I feel about it. I don't know how to answer the second part of that question.
Sorry, I'm old-fashioned.
Does anyone else have any questions?
So given the experiences that you've developed over time, what have you learned about the battles that you choose to fight and those that you choose to abstain from?
That is a great question. I would say, for the most part, I tend to be someone, and I think I've shown this especially on social media and in person, I really will never throw stones at somebody or cast somebody out, even if we think very, very differently on issues. In terms of deciding what energy I'll put into legislation, when somebody reaches out to me, a lot of times the way I get input is from these kind of meetings and meeting with constituents and just people that call in. And I'll spend about a month, my staff we'll vet it. We always reach out to the opposition first and see what their issues would be, and then talk to the support and see how much support we'd get, and then we decide whether it's something we could move forward on. Now, if it's something that is really important in the sense of timing, like corrections reform, that is a battle I'm willing to go out on a limb on and work immediately on, even though the stakes are hard when it comes to something like corrections reform. There's a lot of established interest in keeping the system the way it is, which is broken, and so that's one where I'm willing to take on a battle where I'll definitely be the underdog.
Speaking of picking battles, there's been a big debate of property tax reform. How do you see that being addressed, and where is that going to go from here?
So I was just in a 2-hour meeting on that today, and trying to figure out the way that we can address the main cause of property tax issues in the state, which is education funding and a lack thereof from the state, which requires then local districts to raise their levies. And so what I'd say is I don't know if there'll be a solution. I think we're getting close to it. What I will say is one of the reasons we have been incapable of passing major reforms, well, there's a few, but one of the main ones is just process. We leave the revenue debates for the last 3 weeks of session in the last 2 years. Actually, the last 3 years I've served. We're all exhausted. Our political capital has been spent. We've been negotiating on other issues. And so to think that we could talk majorly around revenue in the last 3 weeks of session is just not workable. So I've been pushing that we talk about this straight out the gate in January when session starts again. I think the other issue, too, is and I think there's a lot of dynamics that have caused this, but we live in a world right now where I find we're in a kind of place where elected officials aren't willing to take any risks with their decision making or do anything big, because heaven forbid there's a mistake or something doesn't work with that decision, which is always a potential. It's ruthless how upset people can get, and not look at a mistake or something that didn't go well as inevitable with any kind of policy decisions. And sometimes you have to take a risk and then tweak it and figure out what will work. And so I think there's a real hesitancy these days in politics to do anything big. And sometimes I joke, like, I don't even know if we would have been able to build the highway system with the current sort of political climate where people are really terrified of doing big, bold things, and the risks associated with that. So I think both of those dynamics have made it really hard to do that.
You talked about raising revenue. Has there been any talk of slashing spending or like curbing the spending or bringing it down?
Yeah, and I don't even necessarily know if it's entirely raising it or whether it's looking at, so you have three ways to address revenue side of things. You can cut spending and find efficiencies. You can shift the tax burden to a different form of tax, whether it be sales or income, or you can grow the economy and you grow the base of people that are putting money into the system and everybody pays less. I think we have to look at all of those. The last one is a much more long-term decision-making, so it sometimes gets left to the wayside, but frankly, I think it's the biggest win-win for addressing taxes. I think there is some look at, we have a ton of sales tax exemptions, so there's a look at doing that. In terms of efficiencies, yes. I mean, there's obviously you've got to look and find efficiencies, but I served on appropriations committee where we had $1 billion deficit out of a $4 billion budget that we had to cut. So we have spent the past 2 years doing significant cuts, and there comes a time where we either have to decide as a community whether we want those services anymore, or we have to recognize that they come with a cost.
We have time for one more question.
Hi. I have a question in regards to marijuana legalization. And I used to work with a lot of people in the farm industry in California and Washington State. And one of their, complaints when they got marijuana legalization, even recreational, was that people were still going and buying it illegally. And, while I'm not necessarily, in favor of that, or opposed to decriminalization, I would say one of my concerns is there an effective way to deal with the illegal market once it's legal so that people buy it, in a regulated fashion? I was just wondering how you would address that.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think what I'll say is that until you have federal reform, I think you're always going to have some friction with a legal market and an illegal market. Because we don't have federal reform, businesses in the marijuana industry do not get the same benefits as other businesses in other legal markets, which means that their product is more expensive, and you're battling then against an illegal market where they don't have to follow the same regulations. So it may be less expensive to purchase that way. What I will say is 100% of the people in Nebraska who are currently consuming are consuming in an illegal way. So if we legalize it in the state, you'll see a significant decrease in terms of the illegal market. Will you get rid of it entirely? No, not until we have federal reform.
Sorry, turn the microphone off. Thank you, Senator Wishart. Our guest this evening is Ali Schwanke, the founder and CEO of Strat and the co-founder of Brand Plan. Ali and I are pretty good friends through Lincoln's startup community, so I knew about her work as a business leader before the evening. things I learned while prepping for tonight was that Ali has contributed to Huffington Post. She was a state trigonometry champion in high school, and she's a fantastic piano player. So Ali, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So to start with, can you give people a sense of who you are, of like where are you from?
Yeah, my parents live on a small farmstead about an hour southwest of here. Yes, they live on the family farm that was homesteaded. We moved there when I was in high school. So if anybody here has moved when they were in high school, notice that anything in high school is traumatic, but moving to a new school in high school when there's 10 kids in your high school class is even more traumatic. So
So you moved to a school with 10 kids?
we did, yes.
What high school was it?
I went to Mulligan High School.
Okay.
I was a rooster. Try to be a lady rooster.
Yeah. And
Some of you just got that.
and before the event, you were talking about your dad being in IT. So were your parents like agriculture at all, or like what were your parents like?
No, so when I was growing up, we liked to play farm. We did some raising of organic produce, and that was back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And back then everybody talked about organic and how it was good for you, but nobody really made it a thing. And so I said, we were just 10 years like ahead of our time, but we would raise and sell organic produce at the farmers markets, and kind of got all of that scene entrepreneurially under my belt. But my parents actually met at Hewlett Packard. They worked together in Colorado, and so I always grew up with a computer in my household, and we were restricted on the amount of time we could spend watching TV, but we were not restricted on how much time we could spend with a computer. And so, I just spent a lot of time getting used to the tech field, and now today my dad's still in the tech field in his 60s, and I am as well.
Yeah. So that produce business you mentioned, was that a whole family ordeal, or was that like a project you spearheaded?
Yeah, it was a whole family deal, and so we so nowadays I have 2 kids, and I still have this feeling that people have to work for things. Things don't get handed to you, and so regardless of how well off you are, and we would go out in the field and we'd capture whatever we needed to for an order. So we would order from like Southeast Community College was one of our customers, and we actually raised sweet corn for them. And so we would husk all the sweet corn, and we figured out little things about marketing and business at that point. So if you actually husk the corn and de-silked it, you could get more money for it than you could if you just gave it to them in the husk.
Okay.
And we also sold like baby mini pumpkins to a grocery store in Crete. And if we washed the pumpkins with a toothbrush so that you got all of the gook off of there, we could charge 25 cents more a pound for the pumpkins than we could if we just got them out of the field and got it to them. So if you wanted a new pair of shoes, anybody here like K-Swiss? I was into K-Swiss shoes in the early 2000s, and I wanted a new pair of K-Swiss shoes. So I went out and harvested a bushel of pumpkins, washed them with my toothbrush, and there you go, new shoes.
Yeah, and I'm sure you look fantastic in those K-Swiss.
Yeah, we'll see. I was like 80 pounds.
Yeah. So after graduating with 10 kids in your class, where did you go to college?
Yeah, I got a full ride scholarship to Wayne State College, so go state colleges. But at that point, growing up in a conservative family, it was you go to college wherever they give you money, and where they give you money, you graduate debt free. So that was excellent for me because I got a chance to kind of explore a lot of different things, and that's where I fell in love with basically running every organization on campus and creating rally around causes that I was excited about.
Okay, and what were some examples of causes?
Well, I was a student body vice president, so I'm not a senator, but I rallied for better prices on textbooks when you turn them in.
Oh yeah.
I also was introduced to the world of people finding things in your past that will serve for any type of slander that will find their way to the front page of the college newspaper. It wasn't my poor news that found its way to the front, but my running mate had an incident that he had built some sort of thing with chemicals in his room, and at the last minute figured out it would go off, and so he threw it out the window. And so they positioned it as a bomb that had gone off, which wasn't a bomb.
Okay.
But journalism, newspaper, and so we woke up the next morning, and he calls me 'cause, again, were calling each other, not texting each other. It was days ago, children. But he calls me and he says, "Have you seen the front page of the newspaper?" And I said, "No." And he's like, "Well, just don't."
Yeah.
Just don't.
Yeah. So after graduating from college, your first job was in marketing, correct?
My first job was actually I started a photography business.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
And was that a solo gig?
Yeah. I was really I was tired of everyone everywhere on a billboard looking like this. And if you're listening, I'm making this really dumb face with a thumbs up.
Yeah.
You know, because I hated stock photos, and I just ever since I've got my first camera when I was like 8, and I believed in the power of like this visual story you could tell with pictures and video. And I was so tired of everyone trying to say that they were authentic and then giving me the same picture of this woman who works. Like the joke was,